that doesn't happen in my classroom. When I get up, it doesn't suddenly become quiet, but thank you. My name is Kevin Pybus. I'm a professor in the political science department here. I'm also the Provost Fellow for Public Affairs, which means that I chaired a committee that put this week-long conference together. Tonight, I'm privileged and also have the great pleasure of introducing our plenary speaker, Nadine Strossen. Nadine Strossen is a law professor at New York Law School. She is one of the foremost scholars and specialists on the First Amendment, particularly freedom of speech. If you're paying attention to the news at all today or in recent months and years, freedom of speech is, it's too strong to say under assault, but support for free speech is in decline, which is a worrisome thing in democratic society. Increasingly, it seems that an ethos is developing that if we disagree with someone, we somehow have the right to shut them up and prevent them from speaking. So it's a very timely talk, so please welcome Nadine Strossen.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank the audience for your warm welcome. I'd also like to thank everyone who worked so hard to organize this amazing event. The folks with whom I worked the most closely were Kevin himself, Candace Fisk, and Barbara Jones. Now, as a lifelong activist in support of civil rights and civil liberties, starting in my own student days, I really have been Kevin, I'm going to start with the positive about what's been going on lately, and that is the recent upsurge of student activism on campus and even in high school in support of key equality concerns, including the whole Black Lives Matter movement, which of course was kick-started right here in your state in the wake of the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. Students have also been extremely active in campaigning against sexual violence on campus and for transgender rights and for immigrants' rights. But, as Kevin also indicated, there have been many well-publicized incidents where student equality activists have sought to suppress speech that they consider hostile to their causes, including at the University of Missouri itself. And too often, those shutdown efforts have succeeded. Recent examples that I'm sure you followed include the violent shutdowns of scheduled talks by Charles Murray at Middlebury and Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley. And surveys do show strong student support for suppressing speech, conveying what students view as discriminatory ideas, and the support for censorship reflects the assumption that censoring discriminatory speech would promote equality. But I am here to testify as a lifelong activist in support of both equality and freedom of speech, that robust freedom of speech is an absolutely essential tool for promoting equal rights and justice. And I'm also convinced that this is true even for offensive speech, including speech that offends our most cherished beliefs, including our belief, to quote the Declaration of Independence, that we are all created equal and equally endowed with certain unalienable rights. Now, throughout my talk, I'm going to use the term offensive speech to refer to any speech conveying any thought that any of us dislikes because we consider it to be wrong, dangerous, upsetting, or harmful in any way, including because it affronts our strongest beliefs, our deepest sense of personal dignity and security. And I'm going to use the term hate speech, which does not have a precise legal meaning, but I'm going to use it the way it is usually used in everyday discourse, and that is to refer to a specific type of offensive speech, namely biased or discriminatory ideas on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or any other personal characteristics. So my basic point that freedom of speech and equality are mutually reinforcing. That basic point was eloquently endorsed by Ruth Simmons, who was Brown University's president from 2001 to 2012. She was the first African-American president of any Ivy League university. She was Brown's first female president, one of the very first female presidents of any Ivy League university, and throughout her career had faced much gender discrimination and much racial discrimination. But in her very first convocation address, President Simmons chose to powerfully explain the unique importance of free speech, even for offensive speech, even for hate speech. And I really urge all of you to read her whole address. For now, I'm just going to share a few highlights. The protection of speech that is offensive or insulting to us is one of the most difficult things we do. But it is this same freedom that protects us when we are in turn powerless. Of course, we hope that you will all use this freedom responsibly, that you will not deliberately assault, intimidate, or harass others under the guise of free speech. However, you must not avoid expressing your opinions and engaging those of others. I won't ask you to embrace someone who offends your humanity through free speech, but I would ask you to understand that the price of your own freedom is permitting that expression. You know something that I hate? When people say, that doesn't make me feel good about myself. I say, that's not what you're here for. I believe that learning at its best is the antithesis of comfort. I'm going to repeat that. Learning at its best is the antithesis of comfort. So, if you come to this campus for comfort, I would urge you to walk through yon iron gate. But if you seek betterment for yourself, for your community, and posterity, stay and fight. Well, sadly, recent surveys show that too many people, including university students, are at best ignorant about free speech principles and at worst hostile toward them. And the conclusion that I've drawn from this fact is that free speech proponents, including myself, have not done as good a job as we must in explaining why free speech is so important and why we should not impose any more limits on it beyond the substantial limits that the Supreme Court has already upheld, which I'm going to explain in more detail later. But for now, I just want to note that much speech that people have in mind when they say we should restrict offensive speech, we should restrict hate speech, much of it is already restricted because it directly causes certain serious harms. Most importantly, the Supreme Court has held, and civil libertarians agree, that we may restrict speech that poses a threat or that constitutes harassment or bullying or incites illegal or violent conduct or is an element of a hate crime. But the Supreme Court has also held that we may not punish speech that does not directly cause these kinds of serious harms. In particular, we may not punish speech for the sole reason that its message is offensive or hateful. Now, surveys show that the more people think about these issues, the more they tend to support free speech. After all, it is counterintuitive to support freedom for ideas that we ourselves reject, so it's not surprising that our initial instinctive reaction is that those ideas should be suppressed. And this was recognized by no less a free speech champion than former Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the landmark opinion in which he famously declared, and I'm sure most of you have heard this statement, the First Amendment protects freedom for the thought that we hate. But Holmes recognized our natural human tendency to resist that notion. As he explained, persecution for the expression of opinion seems perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law and sweep away all opposition. So having recognized the innate appeal of silencing hated thoughts, Holmes goes on to explain why, on reflection, we must overcome that natural instinct. As he said, but when people have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may well come to believe that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Therefore, we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe and even to believe to be fraught with death unless they imminently threaten the country. Well, on a much more vernacular level, author Nat Hentoff also well captured our natural human tendency to try to suppress whatever ideas we personally dislike, and he captured it very well in the title of a book called Freedom of Speech for Me, but Not for Thee, How the Left and Right Relentlessly Censor Each Other. And in an even more pithy version, an editorial writer for the Los Angeles Times said, you know, the urge to censor is the most basic human drive. It's even far more basic than the sex drive. So all of us who have this desire to suppress ideas we disagree with, it's something we all share with each other. Contrary to much popular misunderstanding, there is no general exception to the First Amendment's free speech guarantee for speech whose message is offensive or hateful. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has repeatedly reaffirmed that what it calls the bedrock principle underlying our free speech rights is that government may not suppress speech just because officials or members of the public disapprove of the ideas it conveys, even if the vast majority of us consider those ideas to be absolutely abhorrent. And this cardinal bedrock principle is usually called by us lawyers content neutrality or viewpoint neutrality. So it bars government from restricting speech just because of any negative intellectual or emotional reactions to its content, its message. To distinguish this speech from the types of constitutionally punishable hate speech that I listed earlier, threats and so forth, I'm going to refer to this as constitutionally protected hate speech. As a free speech fan, I of course encourage questioning and critiquing of all orthodoxies, including speech-protective Supreme Court rulings. So I hope I can persuade you to accept that First Amendment jurisprudence, not because it is established, but rather because on reflection, you agree that it is correct. So toward that end, I'd like to quote someone who speaks with special authority in endorsing these principles, and I'm referring to former President Barack Obama. His expertise on this issue stems from not only his background as a constitutional law professor, but sadly also from his vast experience as the target of vicious, vile hate speech. Yet former President Obama strongly endorsed the classic First Amendment view that hate speech should be strongly protected, not despite his commitment to racial justice and to equality, but precisely because of those commitments. And he constantly talked about this topic, especially during the last couple of years of his presidency when it became very current controversy on college campuses. campuses. In fact, in the last two commencement addresses that Obama gave before he left the presidency, this was a major theme for them, one of them at the historically black Howard University. He has championed campus free speech even for language that is offensive to African Americans or sends a demeaning signal towards women. After all, as campus activists in the Black Lives Matter and anti-sexual assault movements remind us, meaningful reform requires candid, in-depth conversations about race, sex, and gender. President Obama made this point. He said, being an activist involves hearing the other side and engaging in dialogue, because that's how change happens. The civil rights movement happened because the leadership consistently sought to understand the views of the other side, even views that were appalling to them. President Obama likewise repeatedly championed the time-honored First Amendment precept that the appropriate response to hate speech is not to suppress it, but rather to answer back, what we often call counter speech. As he said, anybody you disagree with, you should have an argument with them, but you shouldn't silence them by saying, I'm too sensitive to hear what you have to say. Now, he did recognize that it might be especially burdensome to students who are targets of hate speech to answer back, but he also recognized that this effort is an essential step toward the social reforms that we are championing. As he said, yes, this may put a slightly higher burden on minority students, but you are not going to make the kinds of deep changes in society that those students want without taking on their opponents in a courageous way. Now, it is also critically important that all of us respond to hate speech, not leave it to those who are the immediate targets of that speech. And everybody, starting with the leaders in the pertinent community. So on university campuses, the university president, as well as student government organizations, should also speak out strongly. They should defend the right to convey even hateful, even hated ideas, but they should denounce those ideas. And I like to describe this as censuring speech, not censoring speech. And on this point, I'd like to cite as a fine example former Harvard University President Derek Bok. During his presidency, some students hung Confederate flags from their dormitory windows, which prompted other students to protest by hanging swastikas from their dormitory windows. And by the way, this illustrates the intractable problem of deciding what should count as hate speech. Of course, the swastika is deeply identified with Hitler's anti-Semitic and other egregiously hateful ideas, not to mention actual genocide. And here I want to interject a personal note that I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. My father was a prison at the Buchenwald concentration camp. He was liberated by American soldiers literally one day before he was scheduled to be sterilized. So I literally owe my life to the American military. My life came within a hair's breadth of being completely extinguished by the Nazis. So of course I abhor the swastika as the Nazis used it. But the Harvard students who hung the swastika out of their dormitory windows were trying to convey the opposite message. They were condemning what they saw as the racism that was being conveyed to them by the Confederate flag that other students were displaying. So should those swastikas count as hate speech, or should they count as anti-hate speech? In any event, President Bach responded to both displays by swiftly issuing a very thoughtful statement that strongly criticized them, but also strongly defended free speech principles. And it's an excellent statement, so I'm going to quote it at some length. He said, "The fact that speech is protected by the First Amendment does not necessarily mean that is right, proper, or civil. I agree with the vast majority in this community that hanging a Confederate flag or swastika in public view is insensitive and unwise, because any satisfaction it gives to the students who display these symbols is far outweighed by the discomfort it causes to many others. But no community can become humane and caring by restricting what its members can say. The worst offenders will simply find other ways to irritate and insult. Those who are not malicious but merely insensitive are not likely to learn by having their displays torn down. And I fear that the resulting publicity would eventually attract more attention to the offensive material than would ever have occurred otherwise. In conclusion, our concern for free speech keeps the university from removing the offensive symbols, but it should not prevent us from urging the students involved to take more account of the feelings and sensibilities of others. Most of the time, I suspect we will succeed in this endeavor. Now, I should also note that the Harvard student chapter of the ACLU engaged in a rather creative counter-speech exercise to convey their disapproval of the ideas that they thought the Confederate flag conveyed. They publicly burned a Confederate flag. And I say that because I realize that many people cherish the Confederate flag as a symbol of Southern pride and a tribute to their ancestors who died in the Civil War. So yet again, one person's anti-hate speech, the burning of the Confederate flag, is another person's hate speech, the desecration of a cherished flag. For the remainder of my talk, I'm going to amplify on the themes that I've laid out. First, I'm going to explain further why the Supreme Court has been right to uphold freedom for offensive expression. This is a broad topic, as there are so many different types of expression that various members of our society consider offensive. Since we are so wonderfully diverse with a huge variety of different ideas, values, and tastes, and I've already cited a couple illustrations of this important fact. One person's offensive speech is somebody else's beloved speech. And one of my favorite cartoons underscores it. It shows three people in an art museum. They're all looking at a classic nude female torso. It's a fragment of an ancient sculpture, minus the head and minus the limbs. And each of their reactions is shown in an air bubble. And the first one thinks, art. And the second one thinks, smut. And the third one thinks, an insult to amputees. So given our wide-ranging views about what expression is offensive, if we allowed government to punish any speech that any person or any group considered offensive, we'd obviously have little speech left. To illustrate that point, I'm going to cite three types of expression that various government officials have tried to suppress as offensive with support from many members of the public. The first is constitutionally protected hate speech, which I've already noted. Although this speech is constitutionally protected as a legal matter, as a factual reality, it is subject to widespread suppression, including through too many campus rules. Recognizing the constitutional issues, campuses do not straightforwardly word these rules as barring hate speech. Instead, they usually refer to civility or harassment, but in substance, these rules are suppressing speech just because its content is offensive or hateful. A second major category of expression that's constantly targeted for suppression because many people find it offensive is anything to do with sex or gender. An important current example is the bar on any offensive or indecent expression on over-the-air broadcast TV or radio. I know very few people, or in many communities, very few people are reliant on over-the-air access to broadcast. Unfortunately, it's mostly poor people, less wealthy people who are in that situation, and what they are able to receive is still constrained in a very archaic way that does not apply to any other media, including cable or satellite or internet TV. But the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, imposes enormous penalties and not only monetary fines, but even the potential loss of a broadcast license for what it defines as, what Congress has defined as offensive broadcast expression. And the definition is depictions or descriptions of sexual or excretory organs or activities. And these include the famous or infamous so-called 7 filthy words, referring to a monologue that comedian George Carlin used to satirize these words. And that is why, to this day, when I do radio and TV interviews about one of the most important Supreme Court First Amendment decisions ever issued, Cohen versus California, upholding the right during the Vietnam era of a student to wear a jacket saying the draft, that word appears in the Supreme Court opinions, the official opinions of the United States Supreme Court, and yet I get bleeped on radio and TV when I'm describing what the Supreme Court ruled. Let me, I have to say that with enormous bipartisan support, including my then Senator from New York, Hillary Clinton, Congress, while she was in the Senate, overwhelmingly voted to increase the penalty for each so-called filthy word. It had been $32,500. It is now literally $325,000 per word. And I'm going to cite one example of the many examples of self-censorship that we have because of this enforcement of a draconian rule against offensive speech. Several years ago, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of a landmark free speech case in which the ACLU successfully defended poet Allen Ginsberg's acclaimed poem Howl against a criminal prosecution. We won that case. To celebrate the anniversary, the Pacifica radio station in New York was planning to air a recording of Allen Ginsberg reading his famous poem. But for any of you who have read it, think of the number of offensive 4-letter words in that poem, multiply them by $325,000, and you understand that that station would have been bankrupted if it had gone ahead. So sadly, as a prudent business decision, it decided that it could not celebrate the free speech victory in the courts by having the poem read over the air. And there are many other recent examples of expression touching on sex or gender that is suppressed as offensive. Many of these come from colleges and universities because too many have adopted an overly broad, distorted concept of sexually harassing expression as encompassing any expression about sex or gender that anyone finds subjectively unwelcome, no matter how unreasonable or even irrational that subjective reaction might be. The most egregious recent example is the prolonged sexual harassment investigation that Northwestern University conducted against film professor Laura Kipnis because of an article she published in the Chronicle of Higher Education. This wrong-headed concept of sexually harassing expression flies in the face of Supreme Court decisions stressing that speech may constitute punishable harassment only in narrow circumstances. And I'm going to cite the definition that the American Association of University Professors has advocated, consistent with Supreme Court rulings. Speech that is objectively offensive and substantially impairs academic or work opportunities. And moreover, in the teaching context, the speech must also be severe, persistent, pervasive, and not germane to the subject matter. So again, I'm not advocating, nor has the Supreme Court advocated, absolute protection, but just saying we have to have a narrower definition, and certainly one that's anchored in an objective, reasonable person approach, as opposed to anybody who subjectively finds any speech unwelcome. Again, given the marvelous diversity of our views, that is a prescription for absolute censorship, far from absolute freedom of speech. Many cultural commentators say that America's tendency, our tendency as Americans to take offense at sexual expression traces back to our puritanical heritage. And that point was well made by my fellow Minnesotan, the writer Garrison Keillor. He said, "My ancestors were Puritans from England who arrived here in 1648 in the hope of finding greater restrictions than were permissible under English law at the time." Since sexuality is an especially personal area, our views about it are especially subjective. And so it is especially wrong for government to take away our individual right to choose in this area. We can't delegate to any official or to anybody else the deeply personal choices about what sexual expression we will see or we will not see. And we individuals even have different perspectives about whether any given expression has any sexual connotation at all. And this is captured by the old joke about a man who sees every single ink blot that his psychiatrist is showing him as wildly erotic. And when his psychiatrist says to him, "You're obsessed with sex," the man says, "What do you mean I'm obsessed? You're the one who keeps showing me all these dirty pictures." So let me now turn to a third category of expression. So we've had, that's been deeply and widely considered offensive. So we've had hate speech and we've had anything to do with sex or gender. And the next major category is expression that is seen as unpatriotic. And recently we heard these kinds of complaints about taking a knee, the kneeling by Colin Kaepernick and other athletes during the national anthem to protest racial discrimination and police brutality. This expression was condemned by even such a liberal icon as Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And while she later apologized for what she called her inappropriately harsh tone, she did not recant the substance of her critique. Another vivid example of speech that is viewed as unpatriotic and hence hated and viewed as offensive is burning or otherwise desecrating the U.S. flag. Enforcing this core content neutrality principle that I described earlier, the Supreme Court has upheld the free speech right to engage in such symbolic expression, burning the flag in protest of a government policy. But public opinion polls have shown that most of the public considers this expression to be deeply offensive. You may remember that President Trump, I think it was before he was inaugurated, shortly after the election, took a very strong stance against burning the flag, saying that people who did that should be deported or, strongly punished in some ways. But this is a widely shared view, again, to cite his opponent in the presidential race. Hillary Clinton was one of a very large number of senators on both sides of the aisle who also had voted to amend the Constitution to come up with a statute or way of getting around the Supreme Court decision here. On the constitutional amendment, since the Supreme Court first issued those decisions, there have been repeated pushes to amend the First Amendment to expressly allow an exception so that flag burning could be punished. So, and the last time the United States Senate voted on it, it came within one vote of getting the necessary supermajority for amending the Constitution. So if we were to take public opinion polls and polls of our elected officials, more than 3/4 of the states have already passed ratifying support for amending the Constitution on flag burning. That would be what most people would consider the most hated, the most hateful, the most offensive expression. On the other hand, I can use the flag to illustrate how completely irreducibly subjective it is to label some speech as offensive and as hate speech. Recently, some college students treated the flag itself as hate speech. In other words, they had the exact opposite view from the many folks who want to amend the Constitution because they so deeply cherish the flag. A couple years ago, a group of student government leaders at the University of California at Irvine voted to ban the display of the U.S. flag in their campus student center due to what they viewed as the flag's hated and hateful messages. And I'm going to quote their resolution. "The American flag has been flown in instances of colonialism and imperialism and can therefore be interpreted as hate speech." As the Supreme Court has recognized, freedom of speech is especially endangered whenever the government bans or regulates speech under such inherently vague and subjective labels as offensive or hateful. Lacking any clear or objective guidelines, authorities who are enforcing the law necessarily have to exercise their unfettered discretion according to their own subjective tastes and values or those of powerful community, politically powerful community interests. So that means that the enforcement patterns are going to be arbitrary at best, discriminatory at worst. At best, which particular expression is going to be deemed offensive or hateful is going to be completely unpredictable, and that causes what we call a chilling effect because no one wants to run the risk of investigation and prosecution, let alone punishment. So people self-censor, not engaging in expression that might be viewed as sufficiently offensive or hateful by the powers that be. And the unfettered discretion that's required to enforce these vague concepts is also likely to be exercised in a discriminatory way, singling out expression that is produced by or appeals to individuals or groups that are relatively unpopular or powerless. And when you look at the recent enforcement record of prosecutions against sexually oriented expression, the FCC indecency enforcements, disproportionately targeted are expressions of lesbian and gay sexuality, rap music by young African American men, and feminist anthems. Likewise, campus hate speech codes have been enforced disproportionately against the very racial minorities who are their intended beneficiaries. And when you think about it for a moment, we shouldn't be surprised by these enforcement patterns, should we? As the Black Lives Matter movement has forcefully reminded us, this is the general pattern for all laws. They are enforced disproportionately against African Americans and other minority groups. In the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus a bit more on constitutionally protected hate speech because polls show that many college students in particular feel particularly strongly, unlike the rest of the public, which seems to feel most strongly about flag burning on campus, is seemingly to the credit of students who are so wonderfully active in support of equality principles. They have the hardest time in understanding why we defend freedom for hate speech. And to echo Oliver Wendell Holmes, I really understand the perplexity at this position. Since we're fighting so hard against discrimination, why do we allow speech that at least reflects discrimination and perhaps contributes to perpetuating it? My bottom line answer is that censoring constitutionally protected hate speech will actually do more harm than good to the critically important causes of racial justice and equality more generally. I've already made several points that support this conclusion, including by quoting former President Simmons and former President Obama. In my remaining time, I'd like to further explain these and also a few other reasons why suppressing constitutionally protected hate speech will do more harm than good. Before I do that, though, I want to give you just a brief primer, as I promised earlier, on the most important situations in which hate speech may be restricted because of some specific, serious harm that in context it directly causes beyond the mental or emotional adverse impact of being offended. So first, if a hate speech conveys a threat to commit violence and the targets of that threat reasonably fear that they will be subject to violence, the speech may be punished. Second, hate speech that is directly targeted at a specific individual or small group of individuals may well rise to the level of punishable harassment or bullying, targeted expression. Third, as I already indicated, a speech may be punished as what we call hostile environment sexual harassment if it is objectively offensive and sufficiently severe, persistent, and pervasive to undermine equal opportunities at work or in education. Fourth, we may punish any hate speech that intentionally incites imminent, violent, or illegal conduct, which is likely to happen. And finally, hate speech may be punished if it constitutes an element in what is usually called a hate crime, such as assault or vandalism. The government may treat this crime as more serious. It may impose an increased punishment when the target is singled out for discriminatory reasons, such as race or religion. So in sum, a lot of hate speech is already unprotected because in context it causes the specific sorts of harm that many people have in mind when they say we should punish hate speech. So a new exception would be warranted only for the purpose of punishing speech that does not directly cause any of these specific harms. And to be sure, this residual category of constitutionally protected hate speech may well cause palpable psychic and emotional harms. I think all of us, whether we've been subjected to hate speech, as I certainly have, or to any other, all of us have experienced the deep pain that words can cause. And in fact, the reason we protect speech is precisely because of its enormous power to affect our hearts, to affect our minds, both negatively and positively. To explain why we do not punish hate speech or other offensive speech based solely on their psychic harm, I'm going to quote an old saying, which is, "The cure is worse than the disease." Even worse than speech's power to cause harm, to cause pain, psychic pain, is government's power to pick and choose which among the infinite array of potentially pain-inducing words that it will punish. By doing so, government strips us individuals of the power to choose which powerful words we will use, which we will listen to, which we will ignore, which we will reject, and which we will answer back. The Supreme Court strongly reaffirmed these core ideas a few years ago in upholding the right to engage in extremely hurtful, hateful speech, picketing outside funerals of slain members of the U.S. military with picket signs conveying offensive, insulting, hateful views toward members of the armed services, toward Catholics, toward the Pope, and toward sexual orientation minorities. Over only one dissent, the Supreme Court held that this hurtful hate speech was constitutionally protected. And I emphasize only one dissent because you probably know the court is very deeply divided, and it's usually voting 5-4, or these days 4-4. So for all 8 of them, you know, from the most liberal to the most conservative, to agree on this principle, this is really a core constitutional principle. The court said speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and as it did here, inflict great pain. But we cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate. Now, the picketers in this case, I'm sure many of you have heard of them, were from the Westboro Baptist Church based in Kansas. Its beliefs are summed up by its website. I'm going to voluntarily give you a trigger warning. It's a horribly offensive website, www.godhatesfaith.org, all one word. But I'm proud that the ACLU, consistent with the core content neutrality principle, has defended the free speech rights of Westboro Baptist Church, consistent, again, with that core constitutional principle. And we did this, including at the Supreme Court, even though the Westboro Baptist Church has so strongly attacked us because of our work on behalf of the rights of sexual orientation minorities. Indeed, the church even has attacked yours truly personally. I guess it's one of those attacks that you take like a badge of honor. I was speaking at the University of Kansas, and members of the Westboro Baptist Church were picketing outside the audience, protesting my presence. And the signs, the messages on their picket signs were intended to be insulting, but I took them as backhanded compliments. One of the signs denounced the ACLU as the nation's #1 lobby. Yes. And my favorite sign in that demonstration was based on our acronym. ACLU stands officially for American Civil Liberties Union, but our detractors are always creatively concocting other things that they think it stands for, everything from always causing legal unrest, to all criminals love us because we do defend the rights of people accused of crime. And at my Kansas debate, the Westboro Baptist picketers came up with yet another spin on ACLU. They said it stands for the Anal Copulators and Lesbians Union. Many years ago, we ran a contest on the ACLU website for what we thought the best alternative interpretation of our acronym was. And for me, the hands-down winner was, "Aw, come on, lighten up." So I do try to honor that one. Now, as I said earlier, as a lifelong activist for civil rights, I'm really thrilled by the resurgence of activism on campus for equality, for inclusion, for diversity. But I am convinced that censoring constitutionally protected hate speech is at best ineffective at promoting equality and at worst counterproductive. I've already given you some of the reasons. Now I'm just going to list a few more. I'd be happy to amplify on any during the discussion period. So, number one, laws against hate speech are inevitably enforced disproportionately against speech by or on behalf of members of whatever groups are relatively disempowered and marginalized in the particular community. These dissident minority perspectives should always be heard in our democracy, not only because of the speaker's free speech rights, but also so the rest of us can be aware of these views and respond to them. And in too many communities, the marginalized and hence silenced voices will be the very racial and other minority groups who are hoping to be the beneficiaries of these regulations. Secondly, censoring hate speech undermines an absolute mainstay of equal rights movements, which have always been especially dependent on a robust concept of free speech because their views have been seen as offensive and hateful by defenders of the status quo. After all, that's why Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. His speech against segregation and in favor of integration was seen as hateful and dangerous and evil in those communities. Next, censoring such speech increases attention to and sympathy for bigots. Most people I know had never even heard of Milo Yiannopoulos until he was shut down at Berkeley, to just give a recent example. And some people have even said, even accused Donald Trump of somehow conspiring with Milo to stage the protests, knowing that that would at least increase attention and also increase sympathy. Next, in some cases, censorship drives bigoted expression and ideas underground, making it harder to identify who holds them and harder to refute them. If people have those ideas, I want to know who they are. I want to have a chance to answer back. Next, censorship necessarily deals with only the crudest, most vulgar expressions of discrimination, leaving untouched the more subtle and hence the more insidious and influential versions. It deprives those of us who reject hateful ideas of the opportunity to formulate and articulate responses, and it deprives everyone else of the opportunity to hear those exchanges, which is likely to have a net positive impact in overcoming the ideas, more positive than simply silencing them. And in particular, those who are subject to hateful speech are going to be conditioned to expect a higher authority to punish it rather than experiencing the empowerment that comes from responding themselves. Here I want to interject, again, something that to me as a free speech and an equal rights advocate is so thrillingly positive. You know, every year since the late 1960s, UCLA has done a thorough survey of every single incoming college student about their attitudes toward political issues. And this year, those students who came in the fall of 2016 were off the charts, the most engaged of any students since the survey started. And given that it started in the late 60s, which was also a period of high student activism, to me this is really thrilling. In particular, the minority students, in particular the African American students, said that they intended to be politically active not only in campus but also in the larger communities. So they are experiencing the empowerment of protest and exercising freedom of speech. And my last point is that censorship diverts us from more effective strategies for combating discrimination and violence. And many studies have shown that counter speech and education are actually infinitely more effective than censorship. And countries that have hate speech laws, unlike our own, are arriving at the same conclusion. after a generation of censoring hate speech, they're saying, you know, this hasn't worked. We still have hate speech, we still have hate crimes, we still have discrimination, we still have discriminatory violence. We think that for all of the setbacks and all of the ongoing challenges, the positive approaches of counter speech and anti-discrimination laws and fighting against hate crimes and violence that we use in the United States are actually more effective. So let me sum up the balance of what we would gain and what we would lose by censoring constitutionally protected hate speech. The plus side, from the perspective of those who seek suppression, is quite limited. That's because the new suppression would extend to only a subset of hate speech, since we may already punish such speech that directly causes specific harms, as I've explained. And even of that newly suppressible subset, we could only punish yet another subset, namely the most blatant, crudest expression. In contrast, on the cost side, there's an incalculable chilling effect on any speech that challenges prevailing orthodoxy in any community, and also the multiple costs of the equality goal that I summarized. The net loss for both free speech and equality were well summarized by Henry Louis Gates, who is longtime chair of Harvard's African American Studies Department. And again, I'm going to give you a voluntary trigger warning, because Professor Gates in this statement actually uses the N-word for purposes of denouncing it. Now, I have enormous respect for him and his ideas, so I'm not going to censor any portion of what he said, including that word. So to quote him fully, Henry Louis Gates, Harvard University, hate speech codes are symbolic acts. They let a group of people say, we're not the sort of community where we would tolerate someone saying, well, big deal. But there are other consequences, like the effect on freedom of inquiry. I think we're all bigger and more secure than that. I think we have to allow people to say even unpopular and nasty things in order to protect our right to attack our government and say whatever is on our minds. And I haven't been looking at my time signal, but I assume I'm near the end. So I am going to conclude by quoting my favorite ACLU t-shirt. This is the second last quote. Thanks to movies and TV, we're all familiar with the famous right to remain silent, but this ACLU t-shirt reminds us of another right that's not as well known, but it's even more important, especially when we're seeking to advance equality and to counter discrimination, including through the all-important tool of counter speech. So this t-shirt proclaims you have the right not to remain silent. And if all of us who are committed to equal justice for all would exercise that precious right, we would wield far more positive power for more positive change than any censorship. And on that point, I'm going to give the last word to that most eloquent leader, Dr. Martin Luther King. As he said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Thank you very much. So now the audience gets to exercise its free speech rights, and I'll let Kevin call on people because the lights are making it hard for me to see.
Right. We have a couple people with microphones. We'll come to you. If you have a question, raise your hand and get their attention. If you do intend to speak, this may sound ironic, but we're not looking for speeches. We're looking for questions, okay? So if you have questions, just raise your hand and get the attention of the people with the mics. It's bright up here.
Yeah, I know.
Hello. Hi.
My
My name is Emily.
Wave your hand or
She's over here.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Emily, and I grew up in the American school system where,
In where?
in the American school system, public school system, where freedom of speech was like the first thing we learned about the Constitution. It was always revered. And college was a place that if you decided to go, that you would run into new ideas, and you were encouraged to participate in that culture. So why do you think that college campuses are so sensitive now? Like students are more sensitive to those new ideas and don't want to hear them, even though that's
Well, first of all, Emily, I have to say, I don't know what your observation has been here, but I'm on the campus lecture circuit constantly, and I can't tell you how few questions I get from women. So even though women are a majority of students now, so I'm happy to have a question from a woman. Thank you for exercising your free speech rights. I don't know. I think it would take a sociologist or an anthropologist, some culture expert. People have come up with theories. From my civil liberties perspective, and I always do see the glass half full, wow, 90% full. So I think it is because of the wonderfully deep commitment to values of equality and inclusion and diversity, and wanting the campus to be welcoming to members of our society who have traditionally not been welcomed into higher education. Well, that explains only part of it, because then there are people who clearly have grown up in very privileged, white privileged contexts who don't want their feelings to be hurt by general ideas that they find objectionable. And you've probably read some of the I think it's just speculation when people surmise that maybe this is a generation that has been sheltered by parents and by the educational system to not have to deal with any adversity. And here I feel very, very strongly as an educator that we have a responsibility to prepare our students for the real world, where you are going to encounter many, no matter what your perspectives are. If you're going to be engaged in the community and actively engaged in the community, you are going to encounter ideas you disagree with and find deeply upsetting. And we have to prepare you to deal with it in a way that is maximally constructive and empowering to you. So recently there was a flap at Wellesley University, Wellesley College, where Laura Kipnis spoke, and she's been critical of some of the sexual harassment distortions, as I was criticizing myself. There wasn't an attempt to shut her down, but after she spoke, a faculty committee wrote a memo and basically said, if any student feels uncomfortable by any speaker, anything that any speaker says, that's the end of it. That we can't interrogate, we can't question, we can't challenge a student's emotional reactions. We have to respect that. And it's too big a burden on the students to have to think about these ideas they disagree with and to formulate responses. And my view is, no, that's their opportunity being at college. And Laura Kipnis herself wrote back and said, if our view of education is that we're going to shield students from being confronting and responding to ideas that they disagree with, then in Wellesley, the tuition is something like $60,000 a year. She said, that's a $62,000 a year babysitting bill.
Thank you.
So we frequently have preachers come onto campus, and a lot of them are hateful in the fashion of like Westboro Baptist Church, and we can't censor them or kick them off campus. So how would you suggest that we respond as students?
Okay, so I didn't hear the particular example you gave. Can you tell me that again?
They carry signs on their backs, or they have them saying women who wear short shorts are whores. People who are minority sexual orientations.
And not that it really matters, because regardless of what the message is, but I was just curious, thank you. Regardless of what the message is, if you disagree with it, you can respond in a couple of ways. One is you can just ignore it, right? And that's one very potent way of letting it dissipate and fizzle. Just ignore it, pay no attention to it. On the other hand, you may decide that you want to have a more affirmative response by having counter signs, and and there too you could be creative depending on what the message is. Or you may want to engage in a debate. I know a lot of people say, well, if the idea is so indefensible, it has no intellectual coherence. Well, actually, why not take the opportunity to point that out? People say, well, but you're giving it a platform. But there may be people out there that are not yet convinced that it's a bad idea, and that would be an opportunity not just to preach to the choir. I want to give you an example because I know the idea of counter speech can sound rather abstract, but I've seen so many really powerful instances where it has really made a difference. And since I mentioned the Westboro Baptist Church, one of the interesting things about the internet, of course, people will often say, oh, well, the internet and social media, hate speech, and all of this vile, hateful expression is out there and people are in their echo chambers. Well, but it is only a medium, and with all mediums, it is what we make of it. So it is a very powerful vehicle for counter speech as well. It becomes very easy to find out who the hateful speakers are and to counter them, and also to study what works by way of counter speech, because you've got the records. So Google and Twitter and others have started to commission, it's a new field of academic studies now, what kind of counter speech strategies are actually effective. And what doesn't work, by the way, and I find a lot of social science tends to overlap with common sense, and common sense would suggest that, calling somebody a racist, calling them a hate monger is really not going to be likely to persuade them to change their minds, but trying to find some ground of empathy and speak in a conversational way to engage. It's a lot of work is involved. Humor is very effective. Visuals are very effective. Anyway, so some of these cases have been documented, and one involved a member of this infamous Westboro Baptist Church that I mentioned. It's a family-type organization, and one of the daughters of the founder was on the web to spew out her hate of sexual orientation minorities and Catholics and so forth. And some people decided that they would try to engage with her in respecting her as a person, disrespecting her ideas, and after long back and forth, she became converted. And in a very persuasive way, this was all written up in the New Yorker magazine. And there are other similar case studies. So you should tailor it to what the particular situation is. Do you want to use it as an occasion to let them fizzle, as an opportunity to persuade them to change their minds, as an opportunity to demonstrate to the surrounding community that their views are wrong?
Professor Strawson, I wonder if you could talk very briefly about fake news, the bipartisan use of fake news, not so much as it relates to the free press, but the possibility of it being a stalking horse for anti-free speech.
Oh, can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, it seems to be used and thrown up when you want to discredit what's being said, that what is being said is either untrue or biased.
Yeah, and thank you for asking me to be brief. These are such good questions, it's hard to be brief. So you said, I have to say that we are now seeing efforts to censor fake news. I'm not sure if everybody's aware of it. One law has been proposed in California that would make it a crime to post online any false or misleading statement about any public issue. And obviously, we don't want to go down that road, and I know you're certainly not advocating that. But I think you're making a very good point that, that there is a discrediting of everything that we read or see. And I have to say, again, the glass half full, I think we have to be skeptical about everything we see or read everywhere. That, to me, is an answer, not to accept unquestioningly anything you read, but to develop critical viewing skills. So that's the positive that can come out of this. And others have commented that the right has picked up on a lot of groundwork that was laid over the years by segments of the left in saying that all meaning is subjective, there is no such thing as objective truth, and so Trump really takes advantage of that mindset. I see somebody way up in the hinterlands.
Hey. So first of all,
I'm sorry, where?
sorry, right here.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for your speech.
Thank you.
I think I'm from the other side of the aisle, and it's really good to see someone from the ACLU talking about, sorry, that wasn't a comment on the ACLU, but just seeing people come out, because I've seen a lot of people from the right come out in defense of free speech, and so it's really good to see the other side of the aisle coming out in defense of it as well. So thank you for that speech, and thanks to the people putting on this public affairs conference. It's been really great. Okay, so the question is, you've made a couple of references to the Milo Yiannopoulos thing in Berkeley. I think an argument that they might make, the people who protested, was like, this guy is going to incite bad things. He is a Nazi. Trump is a Nazi. That's one of the arguments that they're making. And so our protest is valid. So you talked a little bit about like these, so it has to be an objectively offensive thing that they're saying. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why the people who protested Milo were wrong? By the way, I'm not...
I'm not
sorry,
saying,
go ahead.
yeah. So a couple of points, if I may, because I really liked your introductory comment. There was an excellent report that was put out in the fall by PEN. It's the writers' organization on the whole campus threats to free speech, and it did make a point. It had a little bit of a maybe a dig. It was really phrased as a compliment. We wish the ACLU and other organizations that are more seen as liberal would be more visible in these struggles, because the campus free speech organization that's mostly been handling these cases, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, is wrongly, in my view, but it's perceived as a conservative organization. And because of the constitution of campuses, where by every survey, the overwhelming majority of students and faculty are on the left, so not surprisingly, the perspectives that get suppressed are those on the right. And so more and more students, faculty, members of the community are seeing free speech as a conservative value and not seeing it as a nonpartisan value, much less a liberal value. So, thank you for making that point. I absolutely defend the right of non-disruptive protest, and that goes to the question that I was asked over here. That is a form of counter-speech. And so if the people had simply been standing outside the lecture, even in the back of the lecture with signs, that would have been completely protected speech. I would even defend the right to briefly shout out during the lecture, as long as it did not prevent him from getting his chosen message out to people who are willingly choosing to hear it. But to engage in property destruction and to create such a public safety emergency that even a well-resourced, well-trained police department, as they have in Berkeley, are unable to maintain the public peace. And I mean, this to me is not something that should be happening in a modern democracy. We call it, there's a term that we use in First Amendment law, the heckler's veto. By heckling and going beyond peaceful protests to disruption and violence and property destruction, they are denying freedom of speech to not only him, but to everybody who wants to hear his message. Now, in terms of whether his message could be punished as intentional incitement, interestingly enough, there was a decision, I think yesterday or the day before, by a court involving a speech that Donald Trump gave during the campaign, because the judge ruled that that particular statement could constitute an intentional incitement of imminent violence. And I can't remember the exact words he used, somebody else may remember, but there was somebody who was protesting, and Trump, he said, get them out of here, and did it with a gesture as well as, and it was a direct command, and then some of his hench people, security guards, did jump on the person and commit an assault. And, it's for the jury to decide ultimately what the facts are, but the judge said it is close enough to the legal standard that it can go to a jury to decide. But if it's more attenuated, that he's got a discriminatory idea and that might lead somebody to accept that idea, and then they might, at some indefinite point in the future, engage in a discriminatory act, well, that's the standard we used to have in the United States. It was called the bad tendency test, and it was under that standard that people who protested the First World War, who protested the draft, who advocated for birth control, I'm talking about famous people that were jailed because the Supreme Court accepted this theory. Well, at some point in the future, if enough people accept it and enough people act on it, it might lead to danger to national security. And if you allow that, indirect, attenuated, speculative connection between speech and a feared harm to justify suppressing it, in effect, you're saying whatever speech we dislike, where we disagree with the message, is going to be suppressed.
Up the top left there.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Hannah. First of all, I loved your speech,
Thank you.
Really glad I came here. I almost didn't. Earlier, in answering a question, you talked about possibility of there being rulings against fake news, efforts to censor it. In your opinion, is there any way to distinguish the line between fake news and freedom of speech, or is it possible at all?
I think it would be really, really hard because, again, I mean, just think of the way that we've heard that term used by everybody across the ideological spectrum. It really comes down to whatever they disagree with. And there are matters of opinion, there are matters of factual errors. So let me give you an example. If we talk about an outright, deliberate lie that actually causes harm to somebody's reputation, otherwise known as defamation, that is what constitutes the tort of defamation, you might think, well, that should have no free speech protection at all, right? It's an outright lie. And it's actually harming somebody because you have to show that it causes economic hardship because your reputation has been damaged, you lose a job or something. And even that, the Supreme Court said, we cannot punish it if it's dealing with a matter of public concern, if it's dealing with a public official or a public figure. Why? Because in the rapid fire give and take and debate in the public arena, if you're going to have to self-censor for fear that something you say might be found by a jury, I mean, you're completely positive it's right or wrong, that you're going to make some errors, and the court says we would rather err in favor of more free speech, even if it's erroneous, rather than curbing the robust exchange of ideas. And people, therefore, have to recognize that a lot of what they hear might be inaccurate, right? That's the response. And one of the wonderful things about, and I think one of the best answers to fake news are all of the fact-checking sites that are far more sophisticated than they used to be. But on that metric, all of the candidates were engaging in some fakery and some lying and some deception. But I don't think any of us would want to punish any of them. So the answer, again, is more of a counter-speech, education, active engagement by civil society, not depending on the government for a criminal and punitive approach.
Let's take one more question, okay?
What do you think of the efforts in some quarters to defund hate speech or fake news by going after the advertisers on talk radio and getting advertisers to pull their advertising and therefore defunding the programs, making the programs not profitable?
That's a really, really interesting question. Well, first of all, as a straightforward First Amendment principle, when you're dealing with the private sector, many people are shocked to learn the First Amendment does not apply. The Constitution is only constrained on government. So, but I believe and plus these private sector entities, you know, the Googles and the Facebooks and so forth, have their own free speech rights, and they can negotiate what terms they choose to with their advertisers and with those that are online. That said, I would strongly urge, as a matter of how they exercise their enormous power, that they choose to do so in ways that are consistent with freedom of speech principles. And there's been, and a lot of the social media sites, all of them have their own community standards that they are policing in terms of content, but some of them say we are very strongly supportive of freedom of speech, and the mere fact that one person objects to it is not going to be enough for us to take it down. But all of the problems that you see with government exercising discretion and subjectivity in deciding what is hateful or not, or what transgresses community standards you see on these social media sites. So I really don't want to entrust them, and especially they're using algorithms, right, to decide whether something is sufficiently hateful. How accurate is that going to be? And even the human judgment is not is subjective. One example that got a lot of publicity this summer, and I think it was Facebook, I can't remember for sure, forgive me, it was a big social media platform. I think first through algorithms, but then also through human intervention, withdrew that iconic photograph of the little girl in Vietnam who was running from napalm. And because it was a naked child, it came up as child pornography, which should not be online, and they suppressed it. And it was only after a huge blowback around the world that they decided to put that back up. So I think while I understand advertisers have their own free speech and economic rights to say we don't want our ads to be placed next to content that we object to, we as guardians of a vibrant marketplace of ideas online as well as in other spaces have to keep the pressure up to make sure that this does not too quickly lead to what is in effect censorial power.
Please join me in thanking Professor Strawson tonight.
Thank you for your great questions.